Over 2.2 billion people believe Jesus of Nazareth was God in human form, that he did miracles, and that he lived after his death. But is that just blind faith? Outside of the Bible, is there evidence that he existed at all? And is the Jesus of history anything like the Jesus of the Christian Gospels? Those are big questions.
We'll travel around the Roman Empire to look for mentions of Jesus in non-Christian sources. And we'll ask the question, is Jesus history?
To say that God raised Jesus from the dead means that you have to believe in God. And history cannot assume the existence of God when it's making its historical claims.
The Jewish sources, the Roman sources, Greek sources, the Gospels, they talk about a single set of facts, and that's when you know you've got something that's really happened.
Some say we're accidents in a universe born by chance. Some say we're children of God. I'm Grenville Kent, a Christian academic, and the new atheists have got me questioning my faith. So I'm going wherever the questions take me with my ever-curious son, Marcus, and talking to leading thinkers on both sides of the God question. Because I really want the evidence. Is there a God? And will I ever find a hat that fits? Looking for the history of Jesus, the obvious place to start is his birthplace. You pass through serious security to get to Bethlehem. You see layers of gold and tradition and crowds of eager pilgrims, but many people doubt what the church claims about Jesus. Dr. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar and best-selling author who used to be a Christian.
Jesus was probably an apocalyptic preacher who anticipated that God was soon going to intervene in history and overthrow the forces of evil. Jesus thought that among these forces of evil were the Jewish leaders, and this got him into trouble when he came to Jerusalem for a Passover feast to celebrate the Passover. He got in trouble with these Jewish leaders who in fact found him not just irritating but dangerous. And they turned him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who had him executed. That would have been the end of the story for almost anyone else. There were lots of Jews who got executed for opposing the Roman state. There were a lot of Jewish preachers who got on the wrong side of the law. Jesus was one of them. If the story had ended there, Jesus would be a mere footnote in history. But as it turns out, something happened that was rather cataclysmic. His followers, some of his followers, said that on the third day he got raised from the dead. And they believed that he was alive again, and they started convincing other people that Jesus had come to life again, and people became convinced that Jesus was the Son of God, and slowly this movement started acquiring followers as people would tell stories about Jesus and especially about his death and resurrection. The historian has a real problem figuring out what exactly did happen.
The Christian Gospels are not the only evidence we have. What can we learn from ancient non-Christian sources? Dr. David Instone-Brewer showed us the Jesus references in ancient Jewish sources, like the Talmud.
It's an account of the trial and crucifixion of Jesus, which is historical in the Talmud. But you see there's some gaps. You see that it looks like someone's got their thumb and gone rub, 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 where it says Jesus of Nazareth. So they've edited this text by just getting rid of Jesus' name. Let me show you. It says, on the eve of Passover, they hung Yeshu Nazarene, Jesus of Nazareth. And they hung him for sorcery and for enticing Israel. But we do here have the date on which Jesus died, the eve of Passover, that he was hung, crucified, his name, where he's from Nazareth. Sorcery, that means the miracles are real according to them. And enticing Israel, that's taking people to a new religion. So that's exactly what we'd expect them to say about Jesus in a negative way, but backing up the Gospels in a positive way. A historic source entirely independent of the Gospels and come down to us through Jewish heritage.
He also mentioned a strange Roman inscription found in Israel, the Nazareth inscription.
It's talking about stealing corpses. You mustn't steal corpses. Now, you'd think there'd be a law against stealing grave goods, you know, because people get buried with valuable things, but it doesn't say anything about that. Now, this is a high-quality Roman artifact. It's a marble, it's signed with the authority of the emperor, and it's not talking about Roman corpses, because the Romans, they burnt their corpses. So why have a Roman law against stealing Jewish corpses? It looks like they had some problems. You know, there was a Jewish corpse which went missing, caused a lot of problems, and what Jewish corpse disappeared and made problems? Well, the corpse of Jesus, you know, because that disappeared under the Romans' eyes, caused havoc all over the Roman world through this new religion. And they send an inscription off to Palestine saying, well, never let that sort of thing happen again.
Now, it doesn't take the Roman Empire by storm or anything like it, but by the time the gospel writers are writing, there are hundreds of Christians, probably over 1,000 Christians in the world, and the vast majority of them were not there to see Jesus say and do anything. They've heard the stories from somebody who heard the stories from somebody who heard the stories, who heard it from someone else, who heard it from someone else, who heard it from someone else.
Gossip is one thing, but what do historians from the Roman Empire say about Jesus, the teacher from the province of Palestina? You might think they'd say nothing. This is the capital city of the world. Why are we bothering about some weird new religion in Palestina, wherever that is, some tiny, far-flung part of our empire? So our soldiers crucified some religious zealot for insurrection. Pfft, what's for lunch? This is Rome. And yet you find a surprising number of references to Jesus. There's a clue in a history by a pagan Greek named Thales around AD 55. Thales describes a darkness as Jesus of Nazareth is crucified. The Gospels also describe this darkness, but Thales says it's an eclipse of the sun. Thales's 3-volume history of the Mediterranean region has been lost. Fortunately, we have quotes in works like A History of the World by Africanus, a Christian writer around AD 200. Thales records one striking detail of the Jesus story in common with the Gospels. He offers a miracle-free, naturalistic explanation of that. But he doesn't say the whole story's a myth. In fact, the opposite. He records the crucifixion of Jesus in his history book within about 25 years. We've come to London to read a letter written around AD 73 by a man named Mara, son of Serapion. Mara mentions 3 different wise men and the troubles that came on the cities that killed them: Socrates in Athens, Pythagoras in Samos, and a wise king in Jerusalem. It's in a 1400-year-old book. Look at it there in beautiful, neat Syriac, which I can't read a word of.
This letter is saying, hey, you know, don't spend your life trying to get rich. You know, there's only so much you can do with riches. Get wise. It's the sort of thing your dad tells you, you know, study hard at school, you know. And he happens to mention other wise people. And I can imagine the son saying, yeah, Dad, but these wise people, they all got killed. Because his dad then comes back and says, yes, but the cities that killed Pythagoras and Socrates, they were punished for it. And also, this is the interesting bit now, there's a wise king in Judea, and the city of the Judeans got destroyed. Jerusalem got destroyed. Now, he's writing just after 70 AD, so the destruction of Jerusalem has just happened. It's common knowledge that the Jews had this guy who claimed to be a king, who had wise sayings, and he was killed sort of within a generation of the destruction of Jerusalem.
So Mara is a very early non-Christian source for Jesus' existence and his execution. We travelled to Turkey, a key part of the Roman Empire. Here in the province of Bithynia was an interesting Roman governor named Pliny. In AD 110, he writes to Emperor Trajan over in Rome and says, "What do I do about all the Christians in my area?" Pliny knows a little bit about Christians because he's interrogated some people who used to be Christians until they were threatened with death.
He wrote about how he was rounding up Christians and interrogating them and telling them that unless they worship the emperor and so on, that they would be executed.
Pliny describes Christian worship. They regularly assembled on a certain day before daybreak. They recited a hymn antiphonally to Christus, as if to a god, and bound themselves with an oath not to commit any crime.
The really interesting thing there is that they seem to be worshipping Christ. So put together the logic that Christians aren't prepared to worship any other god, they're not prepared to worship the Roman gods, and here they are worshipping Christ. That can only happen if they have actually thought that Christ is the real God. And so I think what Pliny shows is that this idea that Jesus is God is not something that developed hundreds of years later. It's actually something that's there really early on.
More skeptical writers say Pliny gives us what Christians believed about Christ, but not an independent historical source about him. That seems fair. But Pliny's report doesn't fit with the theory of a mere man becoming God, as miracles were added to his story across time. Pliny shows Christians worshipping Christ as God early. I wouldn't claim that's overwhelming proof, but it's one important piece of evidence.
We looked for the biggest hats in the Grand Bazaar.
That's the symbol of Sufism.
Is it heavy?
Now you are happy.
I'm happy, thank you.
Everybody happy.
Everybody's happy.
One funny writer who mentions Jesus is a guy called Lucian from Samosata in eastern Turkey. Lucian is a satirist and he mocks everything. He tells his readers, if you want free food and accommodation when you're traveling, pretend to be a Christian and go to a church. They'll look after you, and if they find out that you've been lying to them, they'll be nice anyway. Then Lucian says Jesus is that man who was crucified in Palestine for introducing the new cult to the world.
Who was Lucian of Samosata?
He's a great guy. He is a real skeptic. He collected stories, ghost stories, stories of miracles, stories of new religions, and he debunked them. He was the mythbuster of the first century, and he found out what the origins were of new religions and publicised the way in which the crooks, making themselves out as priests, were starting up these religions and making loads and loads of money. So he was an utter skeptic.
Lucian is not the only writer skeptical about the origins of Christianity.
Some of the disciples had visions of Jesus. We don't know how many of the disciples had visions of Jesus. In the earliest accounts, Cephas is said, Peter is said to have had a vision. Mary Magdalene is said to have a vision. The Apostle Paul later is said to have a vision. So I think those three, the traditions also have a very strong element of doubt expressed. Whenever you have an account of Jesus being raised from the dead, people doubt it. And it's hard to understand why they would doubt it if he was right there in front of them. Moreover, we know from scholarship on visions that when people have a vision, whether it's a real vision or whether they're seeing something that's there, whether they're hallucinating, they almost always believe it. And so it's hard to explain this doubt tradition in the Gospels if everybody present had this vision. And so my guess is that a few of the disciples had visions and they told the others about it, and many of these others came to believe then that Jesus had been raised from the dead.
Some scholars argue Lucian was just repeating stories he'd heard from Christians. But the word he uses for crucifixion is not the one Christian writers normally use. He literally says to impale. So perhaps that's the clue that he'd done research outside of Christian sources. He says of Christians, the poor wretches have convinced themselves that they are going to be immortal and live for all time. So they despise death and even willingly give themselves into custody. Their first lawgiver persuaded them that they are all brothers. Live forever? Poor wretches. Lucian thought Christianity was a joke, a free lunch. He was a hostile witness, and he'd be horrified to know that his writings have lent historical support to two key details of Christianity: the existence and the crucifixion of Jesus.
So far we've had interesting clues to the history of Jesus, but we're about to look at Tacitus. Tacitus was governor of the Roman province of Asia, based here in Ephesus. That was his day job. He loved writing history, and he's regarded as one of the finest Roman historians. Tacitus mentions Christ. It's in a section on the Great Fire of Rome under Emperor Nero.
Nero becomes emperor at 16, you can tell by the stubbly beard, kills his mother, marries 7 people, including 2 men, one of whom he has castrated, a real piece of work. So when a fire breaks out in Rome and some want to blame him, he instantly looks for another group to blame. I know, that new religion, Christians. Let's torture them. Nero substituted as culprits and punished in the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men, loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians.
So Tacitus wrote about the Great Fire in Rome around the year 64, so he's about age 8, yet he was in the city at the time, and he wrote about how the Christians were rounded up and persecuted, having a really hard time, and he wrote about how Christianity had all begun because this guy Christus had started it.
Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate.
He says Christus was in Judea, he was put to death under Pontius Pilate. Well, we know Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea from the year 26 through to the year 36, so that gives us a time for when Christianity began. And he also shows how Christianity has spread from Judea all the way to Rome in that time, and there are, by his time, a large number of Christians. So all of that fits very nicely with what you know about Christianity from the New Testament.
Elsewhere, Tacitus calls Christianity a disease and a pernicious superstition, but he records key historical data about Jesus.
He was executed during the reign of Tiberius. He was sentenced by Pontius Pilate. And Christianity grew, even in Rome, despite persecution.
And that matches the New Testament record.
Christian apologists sometimes say that there must be truth behind Christianity because it grew and became a dominant religion in the West. I frankly have never understood this argument, because if that's the argument, then what do you say about the other religions that grew?
It may well be, of course, that many people became Christians when they saw the way that people actually were willing to go to their death as Christians in that persecution.
Tacitus doesn't say Christians believe Christus was executed under Pontius Pilate. He tells us based on his own research. And we know he had access to official court documents and the archives of the Roman Senate. So this is an independent historical source.
He's got this interesting phrase where he says that the pernicious superstition was stopped for a moment, only to break out once more, not only in Judea, the home of disease, but also in the capital, that's Rome. So it's the nice idea of it having been suppressed and then breaking out again, which would really fit very well with the leader having been executed and somehow it all starting over again, which would really fit well with the resurrection.
Some scholars have argued that a Christian faked those lines and inserted them into Tacitus's work. But why would a Christian call Christianity a disease? Tacitus loathed Christianity, yet he recorded the death of Christ as a fact of Roman history. I find that hard evidence from one of the most trusted Roman historians, confirming key details of the gospel accounts. And Tacitus saw Christianity growing, and Christians who were willing to be killed, even with torture, rather than deny their experience of Jesus.
We headed back towards the center of the empire, up the Appian Way to the Eternal City.
I love this aqueduct. The precision engineering. You have to get the levels exactly right across 40 miles to deliver water to the city of Rome. It was built by the Emperor Claudius, well, his slaves. And actually, Claudius is the one who expelled the Jewish people from the city of Rome in AD 49. We know this because of the historian Suetonius and Lives of the Caesars.
Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome since they were always making disturbances because of the instigator Christus.
Christus can be a different spelling of Christus or Christ, And the disturbances Suetonius reports may well be riots that broke out when Christians taught publicly about Jesus. The emperor then turns around and blames the Jewish community for these, perhaps because he realizes that the first Christians, like Jesus, are Jewish. The Gospel writer Luke also mentions the expulsion of Jews from Rome, and he describes riots breaking out around the Jewish communities when Jewish Christians taught about Jesus.
But the fact is just a sort of throwaway line, you know, there was this guy called Christ, suggests that, well, no one's trying to prove anything. It's just that it's part of the fabric of Rome now, as well as in Palestine, so that this belief is spreading and they're taking it seriously.
So Suetonius seems to be giving us a picture of controversy surrounding public presentations of the story of Jesus in the capital of the empire just 20 years after his death. There was a philosopher named Celsus who slammed Christianity. He pooh-hooed the idea of virgin birth. In fact, in his book, True Doctrine, he says Mary was having an affair and Jesus was illegitimate and ugly and short. He said people like sailors and tax collectors followed him because he dazzled them with magic and sorcery. But then he taught them to beg and steal for a living. And he says when Jesus died, hysterical women made up the story of the resurrection. Celsus's work is really more of an attack on the Christian stories than an independent historical source in itself. And yet two things fascinate me about Celsus. He never questions whether Jesus really existed in history. And he talks about supernatural events associated with him.
No, not there either.
There's a wheel from Noddy's toy car and a tank from a sewing machine.
We roared up the road to Milan, not for fashion or Ferraris, but for one highly respected historical source about Jesus. It's called the Antiquities of the Jews.
It's written by Flavius Josephus, who was a Jewish general until the Roman armies came and smashed Jerusalem. And so he came to Rome and wrote histories. The earliest complete manuscript, nearly 1,000 years old, is here in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana. Ah, thank you. Josephus mentions a high priest named Annas, and he says he was bold in his temper and very insolent, and that he organized the killing of the brother of Jesus, a man named James. You can see there's the passage and the name James, Iakobos, Jacob in Hebrew.
This confirms the New Testament account.
Josephus also has a controversial quote where he talks about what Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, did to Jesus.
But I don't think it's as useful for showing early things about Christianity.
Scholars believe monks have probably added to this quotation, but there is a solid historical core.
At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was perhaps the Messiah Christ. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who loved him previously did not cease to do so. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians, named after him, has not died out.
Flavius Josephus makes one clear reference to Jesus, and another with some questionable details, but a historical core. So a Jewish historian working for the Roman Empire leaves solid support for the Gospels.
We started by asking whether there was evidence for Jesus in historical writings outside the Bible.
How convincing is the non-Christian evidence for Jesus?
Well, I think it's extremely convincing that there was this person called Jesus Christ. So you get the name Jesus from Josephus and you get the name Christ from Tacitus and Pliny. They do show you that Christianity has spread far and fast and it's very difficult being Christian, and you can establish certain core Christian beliefs from them. So I think from Pliny you can show that early Christians believed Jesus was God, I think that from Tacitus we can show something about the execution of Jesus and its timing when Pilate was governor of Judea. The burden of proof is on anyone who wants to dispute those things, and they fit really well with the New Testament.
We've seen a number of non-Christian historians reporting on Jesus, his name and title in various languages, Yeshu, Christus, Christus, and the Wise King, and his brother's name, his teaching, reports of supernatural events, his death linked to both Roman and Jewish histories, and the Christian community that told his story even under persecution. These writers are hostile to Christianity, and yet they offer independent backup to key details from the Gospel stories, which gives me a reason to read the Gospels as credible history. What do you think?
Next time on Big Questions, we'll look at the New Testament biographies of Jesus and ask whether they're believable or could have been changed. See you then for more Big Questions.